Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Derp Your Hooves. So today we are on the F-86 by Shrike Simulations, and this is actually one of the United States Air Force's first jet fighters. So I have one small mod. I cleaned up the cockpit a little bit with a cockpit gauge cleanup mod that you can get on flightsim.to, but I have not changed the flight characteristics of the aircraft. So let's go over a little bit about the F-86 since we're sitting here. So the F-86, again, it was one of the United States' first jet fighters. Um, it was actually set to compete with the MiG-15, and it said that the MiG-15 was actually a better airplane than the F-86, but the F-86 has somewhere between a 10 to 1 or 8 to 1 kill ratio versus the MiG-15. So what I've read is that the American pilots were better trained, and when you'd say, well, how do you know that they fought the MiG-15? Well, because they fought the MiG-15 in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. So the aircraft was actually first flown in 1947, but it didn't reach service with the United States Air Force until 1949, and then, hey, the Korean War happened in 1950. So the P-51D would not have been a match for the MiG-15. And from what I remember reading long ago before the internet was that the P-51 did serve in the Korean War, and they phased it out really quickly because people were just not, it wasn't the plane to be flying in that war. So anyhow, another fun fact about that, the F-86, is that the Korean War, if you've never known this, has never ended. It's just in a truce right now, believe it or not. So some people say, well, there was no real victory. Well, the victory was making sure that the North didn't overrun the South. So with all of our history lessons aside, let's go ahead and show you a couple things about this aircraft. And again, this has been out for a few weeks. So, this is my basic Derp Your Hooves model where I have, a little bit of a customized livery, but not much. You might notice, see, the aircraft has nothing on it right now. So let's actually go into how to change that. So what you'd want to do is you'd want to go up here to your menu and not click on canopy glass visibility, but you'd want to go to weight and balance. Now if I go to weight and balance and I bring the window down a little bit more so that I have more stores, you see I have a left drop tank and a right drop tank, and I can just highlight those and just collapse the window, not hide it, and the drop tanks show up. Now, as far as I know, the F-86 is currently, as of the time of this video, not available in the marketplace. You can only buy it on the Shrike Simulation website, and it's about 20 bucks. But if it ever does reach the marketplace, I can guarantee you that you won't be able to equip it with weapons. And you might say, well, Pony, that sounds really interesting. So how would I equip it with weapons? Well, what you would do according to the user's manual is you would go, see it says onboard stores, and we're going to leave that alone, but it would have your inboard wing stations and your outboard wing stations. Now, in the owner's manual, again, or the user's manual, it says that if you put rockets on the outer inboard stations, and that's going to be, let's take a look at the manual here real quick, because I forget the exact weight, and that's why we have the manual. The weight is, what is it, 1,500? 10,050? It's one of the two. There's two different weights for the weapons. So let's go ahead and let's look. Here we go. So it's 1050 is going to be rockets, and 1,000 will be bombs. So if you do 1050, you'll see rockets and the plane just dropped. But if I do 1050 here, you see how they just glitched in for a second and glitched out? Well, that's because we have fuel tanks. So if I get rid of the fuel tanks, and then I type in, well, I type in 1050. Like that. And I hit enter. Now it's fully loaded with rockets, and you might say, oh, well, isn't that so cool? Well, it is for a static display, and remember, you can't fire these rockets. But let's say you wanted rockets and bombs. Well, according to this, you type in, it says 900, so let's see what happens when I type in 900. Do I actually get 2 sets of bombs? I do. I had it at 1,000 last time. So you can do 2 bombs and rockets, you can do 8 rockets, or you can do drop tanks and bombs, or drop tanks and rockets. See? And the drop tanks override the bombs. So, and the rockets. So let's just say, well, let's even the weight out, shall we? Let's make it even. So 900 to 1050, 10 pony. 10 pony. Too many zeros, pony. See, that's why I'm getting the warning, because there's 2 zeros. There we go. And then we click there, and the warning goes away, and the rockets come back. So now I have rockets and fuel tanks on the outside, and that, everyone, is how you would configure it with the external stores. So again, they don't do you any good other than looking really pretty on the aircraft and adding weight to the aircraft. So for this, what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and I'm going to go back to weight and balance, and I'm going to get rid of the drop tanks, and we'll just keep the rockets just to keep a little bit of weight on it. So that's how you'd configure it. Now, if you've noticed that I'm doing this in a cold and dark state, so I'm going to show you now how to start the aircraft from cold and dark. So you can go through here and you can go to the checklist, and the checklist is great. It'll say, you know, starting engine, taxi before takeoff. So we're going to do it by the manual. And what the manual says is you go down here to start the engines, and you go ahead and you put external power to on, and you'll hear that gas generator start up. And if you look, there it is. You have ground power. So the ground power shows up, and there it is. And apparently you need the ground power to start it. So you need to throttle forward just a little bit. Oh, Pony has his throttles split from his last flight in the Cessna. So you want to start them a little bit above idle. And so what we're going to do with the ground power on, we now go to battery, and you'd say, well, put it to starter. Well, not quite so. First you have to go over here, and you have to check everything else. And we have our anti-ice screens, our landing lights, our warning lights, the boops and the bops and the bopes, and there's our flight control switch, what we're going to need later. So let's go ahead and let's do this from Pony memory. So what we've done here is we've turned on the external power. It has to be on. And you have to put the engine master to on. And you have to take the battery starter switch and put it to battery. Now watch the RPM gauge and listen to the engines fire up. And you don't push the starter button because it says push to stop starter. So the fuel flow kicked in, and the RPM gauge kicks in, and I think it was about 6%, and says drop it back to idle. And that's why we started it with the throttle up a little bit. And I can even bring it up just a little bit. And you're like, hey, you were at 6%, Pony? We are at 6%, so we're going to bring it back. And we're just going to let the engine start up, and we're going to watch our RPM gauge, which is right here. And you see that the switch automatically went from starter to off. And the engine's still warming up. And you're seeing the RPMs are still warming up. And you gotta let it do this. And eventually it'll reach the right RPM. See, the inner gauge is at 100. And we are there. So we're there. So what you want to do now is you want to switch this to battery. You want to turn the external power off. And you can tell that the external power is off because you flip the switch and the ground power unit is gone. So you are pretty much almost ready for takeoff, but if you notice, I still have a light. See, in this model, although it may not be a study level, you can go ahead and you can push your little fuse buttons and your little check buttons and they light up. And your hydraulic pressure selector's on. So you want to go over here and you want to find this switch, the flight control switch. And you want to cycle it by pulling down, and now the hydraulic pressure switch is off, which is right here. And there's two modes. Well, there's three modes. There's normal, utility, and alternate. I haven't really played with it to see what it is, but I'm not going to worry about that. So I got good fuel pressure, I got good exhaust pressure, I got decent fuel flow, and I have about 50% fuel or so. So about 26 gallons, something like that, which is more than enough for what we need. Now, a couple more small things, because now you've started up the engine. Well, so here's something that I've noticed. In this aircraft, and I've flown it quite a little bit lately, this is your flap indicator, and I have flaps bound to a key binding on my HOTUS. So what you want to do is you want to put this and put the flaps on hold. And you might say, well, why? Well, so rolling it to hold doesn't do anything. But what it does do is when I hit my flap switch to raise and lower my flaps, the flaps hold. Now, I've noticed that when they go to up, the flaps automatically go up. And if I go ahead and I hit the flaps down, nothing happens. And I can hold it and force them down. And I can let off the key. And they go right back up. So, if you want them to hold, you have to put them on hold. Just something I learned. So, we're going to get going. And there's just one more thing that I want to cover here before we get going. Know that we've done the takeoff, the power up, to get ready to taxi for takeoff, and I've shown you how to arm it. Again, you can't do anything with the armaments, but, and we're going to get to that in a second. If I go down here, and I go to gun safety switch guard, and I click it up, flip it back down, go back to the primary view, you see that I have a gun sight. Well, that's all good and happy and dandy, but you can't fire the guns. And you can't fire the rockets. Not as of this version. So, it doesn't do you any good, and even if you could, it would just be, if they ever added it, it would just be for effects. Until they make some kind of Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, air combat simulator. So, since we've gotten this far, let's go ahead and just taxi. And I already have a bunch of views bound, so we're just going to make sure where we're at, and we're going to release the parking brake, and slowly taxi forward to our parking. And say, well, G-Pony, I hope you know where you're going. Well, sometimes I do. We're going that way-ish. So, while we're sitting here, parked, with the engine warming up and the brake off, I'm going to show you something here on this aircraft, it being as old as it is. Remember, I said we have an RPM gauge, which is right here. So as I roll the throttle forward, the RPMs start to climb, and I roll it forward and forward and forward and forward. And it's at 60, and once it gets to about 70, about 65, the aircraft will start rolling forward. You might say, well, that's interesting. Well, it is, and it's actually going to be something that we're going to have to watch when we land, because if your RPMs are too low in your engine, the aircraft will stall out. And that's a big problem for when you're trying to land. So let's go ahead and taxi to our runway at Southern California Logistics Airport. Oh, and I goofed everybody. This is not Orbix software. I may have said that in the past. I will go look up and see where I got it from. And I'll post the link, but it is a payware airport. You can get it for free in the sim, but you don't get it with the airplane graveyard, which is actually there right now. And I know we had a whole contest, and I guess nobody really wanted the sticker. I was going to give you Derp Your Hooves stickers for free. And it was, hey, where are we? And what was it? So we are at Southern California Logistics Airport in Victorville, California, which is the former George Air Force Base, because George Air Force Base was closed right about after the Gulf War. So it is no longer an active base. But it is a great little active airport and a boneyard. Okay. Now, although we do have live players on, we don't have their name tags displayed, but let's go ahead and kind of do this proper and come to the mouth of the runway and at least look, because we're not going to communicate with the tower, because I don't really care much for the Sims ATC, and we're not running any ATC mods. So again, watch my RPM gauge. My throttle goes forward, and once it hits about where it says throttle, that's when the RPMs start climbing. Anything prior to that, you get nothing. So we don't need that much throttle to taxi. But when we do land, depending on how fast we're going, we may need some speed brakes, because there are no air brakes. But we may need some speed brakes. We may need flaps, and we're definitely going to need flaps for takeoff. So let's go ahead and try and get her lined up. And now that we're on the runway, let's get ready for takeoff. So I'm just going to hit the parking brake really fast. And I'm going to go one notch of flaps. With my flaps on hold. Remember, I just showed you that. And the flaps stay. And we're going to turn on some landing lights and some takeoff lights just so they're on. And there they are. Can we get both? I guess we just get one when we do it in the key binding. So, now, you don't need your speed brakes on takeoff. Do not apply them on takeoff, but you will need them on landing, and there they are. You may need them to slow down this aircraft. So there we go. We got one notch of flaps, because you can see the flaps, and if I look out the window, there's our flaps, they're at a notch, right? And we don't have our speed brakes deployed, and this aircraft, sorry about that, has no indicator for your speed brakes or your flaps, so you just gotta kind of know what you're doing. So we're going to release the parking brake, and we're going to throttle it up. And again, watch the RPM gauge. Right underneath the fuel pressure gauge on the left-hand side of the instrument panel. And there we go, and it starts rolling. Now, if I want to do this the painfully slow way, I'll put it at about the throttle it's at now, which is about 90%. But I'd like to get going, so we're just going to go 100%, maybe a little more, just so we get going. And this is a transonic or subsonic aircraft, so it does not have an afterburner. Sorry, every pony. And about the white line is our roll speed. And we lift up by pulling back on the stick. And we're up. Positive rate of climb. Yep. Gears up. Flaps up. And we're off. Let's kill the takeoff and landing lights. We don't need them. Oh, that's the gears, pony. Takeoff and landing lights. Gee, you think I'd know my old key bindings by now. Now, I'm going to mention something here. I'm going to take my hand off the stick, and you're going to see that the F-86 kind of pitches up pretty much all on its own. And if you want to prevent that, you're going to have to trim it. And you see that little light that turned on? That was the trim light. Now, you might say, well, pony, why didn't you just adjust your takeoff trim? Well, let me, pony, tell you why. Because I did that several times, and it doesn't make a difference because there's no actual trim indicator besides the light in the aircraft. So you can adjust your trim for takeoff all you want when you guess where it's at, and it's not going to do anything. And the manual says as long as that little light lights up, that you're in the right trim area for takeoff. Well, I've discovered at least that that's not so for me, and if it's not so for you, don't worry about it. I have a feeling that the F-86 pitches up at high speed. So that's pretty much it for the basic flight. And I mean, we can bring the RPMs back. We don't have to be going at 100 RPM. And we can drop the RPMs back to where they're in the green. Back to where they're in the green, pony. Not where the guards are on your wing throttle quadrant. Right about there, about 95. And just keep it in the green. And you'd think, well, shouldn't the nose drop? Well, I would think so too, but I guess not. I'm going to have to do it manually. So that's, for the most part, most of the basic flying instructions on it, on how to get it to take off. And it does fly really great. I mean, it does barrel rolls and all that stuff. You know, and we can do loops. I've done loops in it too. And I'm just not going to do one right now. Now, you might notice, again, you see we have this wonderful heads-up display, and I showed you that it just displays the gun sight, a lot like some of the other older aircraft, the early Cold War aircraft, like the Phantom had a gun sight. But this actually gives us a different option. So, although there's no head ladder and there's no anything, you're going to rely on your old-fashioned steam gauges, or just regular gauges, as most of us call it, because we don't have the glass cockpit displays that you have in modern aircraft. So, what do we have? We have our altimeter, we have our airspeed indicator, which are very important. So, those would be what? On either side of the HUD, right? How high you are, your altitude, or your airspeed, and your altitude, depending on the aircraft. And it does say, oh look, Mach meter, 0.7, 1.1. Now, so this aircraft does not do Mach 1. If you're lucky, you'll get it to about 500, 550 knots in a dive. When it's cruising, it might do about 450 knots in the sim. And that's about what I've gotten it at. I haven't pushed it too much more than that because it does shake a little bit. And you see that we're still climbing, and that's what I want to do. But you'd say, well, Pony, what were you going to say? Well, this is what I was going to say. HUD GPS toggle. See that? Oh, it takes away our gun sight, and it gives us our HUD GPS toggle, which, if we go to our GPS now, we get a map, just like you would in any other GPS, and it tells you, hey, that's where we took off from, and what other airports are around us. Well, these are the ones that are around us. Look, isn't Edwards around here somewhere? Edwards is right over there. So, we have our GPS, and you can say, well, I would like to go somewhere. So, I can type in direct to, and I can say Edwards, K-E-D-W-A-R-D-S, W, it's next to X. It says Edwards Air Force Base, and I hit enter, and it says activate. And I can go back to my map or my flight plan, and it will show me, when I zoom out, where I am and where Edwards is. And so we took off from Victorville, and we are now here. And I can go ahead and have it center on the aircraft. But there's something else that we can do, is we can go to the 3D vision. And it tells you, just like I said, when you have a heads-up display, what your airspeed is. So it says 568 knots, which is your ground speed, and your altitude. Our altitude is 28,160, and it's pretty much not going to go too much higher. Shouldn't even be at 28. So we're going to go back to our map, and we're going to head to Edwards. And this is kind of a nifty little feature to have. And so you might even say, well, Pony, is there an autopilot? Well, not that I've noticed. So let's go ahead and head to Edwards. And just keep on trucking. We probably could give a little bit of right rudder and turn a little bit better, but we're doing fighter pilot turns like we were in air combat. And you'll lose airspeed by tilting the aircraft like this because you stall the wings out. So you learn something new every day. And you'll notice because our airspeed is dropping. Alright, so we're pretty much on course for Edwards. Now I did say this plane can do a flip, and it can, so let's go to full throttle. Let's actually do a split S. Let's turn it upside down and go backwards. That was really a bad split S. I've been flying helicopters too long. So here's a split S. And what we want to do is back off on the throttle a little bit, pull back, and give it some air brake. I know, and then there's our low speed alarm right there. And then see it shakes a little bit. So, the F-86 being an older aircraft. And now we're headed in the opposite direction. So you could say, well, can we do a loop, Pony? Well, we can do a loop. So let's nose down just a little bit, but you don't have to because we're at about 400 knots. And we just pull up. Pull back on the stick. And it will do a loop. 200 knots. And our airspeed should be picking up as we nose down. 300 knots, 400 knots, 450. Okay. And let's get going back towards Edwards. So, this is a fun little plane. It'll do rolls, it'll do loops, it'll do split S's, it'll do aerobatics. It is a fighter plane. Alright, so let's get back on course to Edwards. So, you can do really cool, fun stuff with the plane. Now, as of yet, I've had no system failures with the plane. The only thing that I have had is that flap issue that I was telling you about, but I have my flap indicator on hold. And we can just go ahead and bring the airspeed down as we're coming in and trying to get lined up with Edwards. I mean, I can even open it up full throttle if I want. And we should significantly lose airspeed. And we should be dropping in altitude. So you might say, well, what was it that you wanted to show us? Otherwise, Pony. Oh. So a lot of people will say, well, this isn't a steady level aircraft. And perhaps that's true. But the funny thing here is, and I haven't really tested them to see if they work, but they do give us breakers. And they seem to work. Actually, that's a good one to know, the landing gear warning. I wonder if I pull it out, if it'll stop complaining every time I slow down. So let's just test that, right? We're going to cut back on the throttle quite a bit. And there's the noise. Now you see, now I can hit the button over here. Right? It says landing gear, come on. Landing gear warning light. And that's just for the warning light, and it does nothing, and I'm not seeing the light. But what happens if I go and I say, no, I'm not seeing anything. Now, that happens, by the way, that happens every single time. Not so much when you drop your airspeed, but when you drop your engine RPM. And let's see when the noise goes away. Don't pay attention to the airspeed. Pay attention to the engine RPM. So we're at 60. And... ooh, 70 not going away. Really? About 80. So if I bring it back, yeah, about there. So, or so. Now I've noticed with that it actually seems to kick in at different airspeeds too, so not totally sure how all that works. But if you want that annoying noise to go away, well, just keep it, you know, at least at about 80% throttle or more. And you've actually got to monitor your engines if you're going to land this aircraft. Edwards should be that mess right over there. So you've got to monitor your engine RPMs when you decide to come and take this in for a landing. And you might say, well, again, how would you know, Pony? And I would say, well, because I've flown this a whole bunch of times now. And if your engine RPMs are like below 70, 80, again, you'll start to stall. And then when you crank up the throttle, it won't do anything because there's like a lag. Like if you've ever like driven a turbo car and you've experienced turbo lag, there's like a turbine lag in the F-86. And I've never noticed it in any of the other fighter planes that they have in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. It's hard to say. It's like it's not so much a compressor stall, I would say, as it's just like it's a lag. It's like if you drop below idle, then it just struggles to get back up to speed. So this is not an F-16. It's not a Tiger Shark. It's not a Phantom. It's not a Tomcat. It's an F-86. See? F-86. And you might even say, well, how do you know there's no afterburner? So let's try that, shall we? Let's crank it up to full throttle. You hear it spin up like that? And then let's even push the afterburner binding that we have on our HOTAS. I'm pushing it. Nothing's happening. This is it. $400 knots. That's what we're going to get right now. And what is it? It's actually 483 ground speed. You know, and like I said, I'm pushing the whole afterburner binding and nothing's happening. There's no afterburner on this aircraft. So you won't get afterburner. Alright, so we're going to go hunt for Edwards, which should be around here. There's the mountain. That looks like Edwards. Over there-ish. So, well, how would you know? Well, again, because I've flown this a bunch of times. So, these two airports, well, airport and Air Force Base are pretty close to each other. And our little purple route indicator is showing us that. Let's go back to map, Pony. Back to map. Alright. .3D vision. And map. There we go. And Edwards should be off to our left. That might be the lake bed that has it. Yeah, probably so. It should be actually dead ahead. If I just do this, I should be looking at Edwards. So let's zoom in. Yeah, there's Edwards. So it's going to be... Oh, Sims freeze and Sims stutter. It's going to be right over there. We're close. That's Edwards. Alright. So what's our current altitude? Oh, so there's that noise I'm telling you about. Because look, there goes our engine RPMs. We're traveling at 400 knots. So our current altitude is 3,000? Wow, I don't think so. More like 13,000. Yep, 13,000. That's going to be too high to land this thing, so we're going to have to hear that noise because I need to drop some airspeed. And you'd say, well, how would you drop airspeed? Well, speed brakes. That'll do it every single time. That'll help you drop some airspeed as your speed brakes. And we throttled back a little bit. Yeah, about 313 knots, so we're good. And I'm looking at what looks like the runways for Edwards. Right off there, to my left. Yep, that's them. 10,000 feet. And we're just going to have to deal with that low RPM noise. Because I don't want to crank my RPMs up. And I just took my speed brakes in. Because remember, there are no air brakes. This is not a bus. It's an airplane. Air brakes are on buses and trucks. Speed brakes are on aircrafts or spoilers. So we make sure again that our flaps are on flap hold because we're going to need our flaps. And we're coming in at about 368 knots. Oof, not good, Pony. Not good at all. And that's the runway we want with a little blinky light. So let's come on in, and we're just going to hear that noise the whole time as we slow down. And don't worry, it'll go away when we get closer and have to bring our airspeed up. So I am seeing that the engine RPMs are at about, I would say, what, about 550 RPM? Almost 600 RPM. We'll find out if it's in the thousands or the hundreds. Right now I don't have time to zoom in on the gauge, and we're going to hit our landing lights. Let's go ahead and extend those. And I did hit the key binding, but I didn't see them extend. So there's that. And the noise goes away because it went away. And then it came back. There we go, because at about 7,500 RPM or so, or 750 RPM, the noise goes away. But we're now traveling at 300 knots, which is going to be too fast, and we want landing gears. And you'd say, well, this far out? And I'd say, yeah, and the landing gears don't deploy until about 200 knots. And if you doubt me, I'll go ahead and I'll show you even without hitting the binding. We'll just release them and you'll see. We get Bilko. We get nothing. Bunko, Bilko, nothing. And our RPMs are too low, so you don't want to do that because what did I say you're going to do? You're going to stall the aircraft. So at under 200 RPM, you just heard the landing gears kick in. There they are. Our speed brakes are out. Let's bring them in because we need to be gaining airspeed. And this is a horrible landing. I'm sorry. But flying the F-86, well, it's fun. It's a different type of flying experience. So we're going to come in. We're at 220 knots. Let's give it some flaps. And the sounds aren't too great, as you can tell. But there they are. Flaps are down. We're losing airspeed, as we should. We're also at a bad engine RPM. We need more. Go. Okay. At about here, about 167. We're going to try not to bounce, but I just can't guarantee you. And we're a little off-center. As long as we hit the runway, that's all that matters. And speed brakes. And cut back on the throttle. Nose up. Was that a bounce? I think that was a bounce. No, no bounce. A little bit of shake. And there we are. That's not too bad, right? I think we did pretty good. So that's pretty much it. That's the F-86 from Shrike Simulations. And let's just go ahead and taxi on over here. Bring our flaps up. Bring our speed brakes in. And go back to the cockpit view. And our taxiway is right there. And see, that's what I'm saying. It's got nothing when you just cut back on the throttle. So, anything under about, well, let's just call it 70 because that's what it says on there. But I'm guessing it's 7,000 RPM. Could be 700. And it's not going to move. And let's taxi out over to parking. So this is a really fun little plane. If you want to add it to your kind of vintage aircraft, your vintage warbirds. And again, it's just not going to taxi at anything under. And I do have add-on scenery for Edwards Air Force Base, and it is freeware, and I think I said it in some of my other videos. So you can get it on flightsim.to. It just makes Edwards, a little bit more interesting. And let's cut back. And taxi on in. Should we bring Grandpa in with all the kids? That'll be fun, won't it? Bring a piece of history into these young whippersnappers. And look, there's a CH-47 off to our left. And we're probably going to be rolling up on F-22s and F-16s, and I think some F-35s. Those are the static aircraft that it usually gives me here. That's actually not bad for freeware scenery either, as I'm looking off. I mean, it looks detailed enough from here, right? They did a pretty good job. And wait, did I say it was free? Yeah, I said it was free. More than once. So, there's the F-22s. There's the F-15s. Let's go park next to the F-22. And we all know the F-22 doesn't have a compressor lag like this. Come on. There we go, and in we go. Center our view. And get us As close to center line as possible. I think we're good. Parking brake. Bring the throttle back. And you might say, well, what now? Well, what you can do is you can open the canopy, but... And I'll show you. If you open the canopy now, and it will open. Oh, landing lights off, pony. That's gears. Landing lights. It'll open the pony and open the pony. Yeah, it will open the pony. It'll open the can-out pony, the canopy. And there's our pilot. You know, there's Grandpa and his F-86 next to the F-22. And you want to kill the engine, so there's two ways to do it. Now, the checklist says you just click the master engine switch, but I'll show you. If you click right here, it says throttle inboard outboard. It brings it inboard and it kills it. And then you can just come on over here and unclick engine master. Now, you have the option to bring your external power back on, but it doesn't always show it. Oh, it does when you're parked. So, now we have our external power on. And you might say, well, isn't that cool? Well, it is. Then we get our chocks back in. Now, but let's say you don't want external power, right? Well, then just turn your external power off. And then you turn the battery to off. And the canopy closes. So you want your canopy back open. There it is. And you should still have chocks and your canopy open and your pilot in, but the aircraft is off. So here you have it. The F-86 from Shrike Simulations. And if I hadn't said it already, I'm going to say it this time. I'm not endorsed by anyone, Shrike or Microsoft. This is just my consumer review of the F-86. Great plane. Not so sure if this is how it has flown when it flew, because apparently there are no more flying from what I read. Not even in service, just in general. I didn't read that there are any flying left. They may be on static display. And I'm going to say the name of the sim. Yeah, DCS. And I have flown it in DCS a long time ago. Don't remember the difference in flight, but two different sims, so two different flight models. So, if you want to have a little bit of fun and you got 20 bucks to blow, well, this isn't a bad way to go. So, as always, everybody, if you like what you saw today, or, you know, even if you don't like what you saw and you don't like Pony, which is fine too, then I still encourage you to like, share, and subscribe to Derp Your Hooves. When I say share, feel free to share my videos. And yep, subscribe. I love my subscribers. You guys help make this show work, and you are very appreciated. So, as always, every pony and everybody, thank you for watching Derp Your Hooves, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the skies.